Live from Washington, this is BBC News. World leaders gather in Kyiv pledging more aid for Ukraine 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. The French president meets with US President Donald Trump to discuss Ukraine and says a truce could be agreed in the coming weeks. At the United Nations, the US joins Russia and North Korea in voting against a resolution condemning the Kremlin for starting the war. Hello, I'm Ritika Gupta and welcome to the program. On the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the US has sided with Russia and North Korea at the UN General Assembly in a voting against a resolution condemning Russia's war. It came as Emmanuel Macron visited the White House for talks, with the French president saying discussions were extremely productive but insisted that peace must not mean a surrender of Ukraine. And in the last hour, President Macron has said a truce between Ukraine and Russia could be agreed to in the coming weeks. We'll be bringing you reports from Kyiv, Moscow and the United Nations. But first, Gary O'Donoghue has our top story from Washington.
It was an optimistic President Macron who came to the White House today, the first European leader to head to Washington since President Trump's re-election. His task, an attempt to reach a consensus over ending the war in Ukraine and to stabilise the transatlantic relationship, which has been severely tested.
Again, the relationship's been very special with France and very special with this gentleman on my right.
It looked like the old Le Bromance between these two was back, but the differences weren't far from the surface, notably on the relative contributions to Ukraine from the US and Europe.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
But Donald Trump continues to insist Ukraine hands over half its key natural resources as compensation for America's contribution. And he says such a deal with Ukraine's President Zelensky is close.
I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office.
That issue of compensation is another bone of contention between the US and Europe. It was up to Russia, said the French president, to pay.
This war costed all of us a lot of money, and this is the responsibility of Russia because the aggressor is Russia.
Where some agreement appears to be emerging is on the question of possible European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine after a truce, something both France and the UK are open to.
We also spoke about these issues at length with the president. We've worked with President Zelensky and gotten to some of the details of the various phases of the negotiation, and we've also been able to speak about some of this work with our British partners to talk about deployments of peace forces on Ukrainian soil, which are part of these security guarantees.
Later, President Macron said progress had been made, including on the question of troops.
And now there's a clear American message that the U.S., as an ally, is ready to provide that solidarity for that approach. That's a turning point, in my view.
There is still no concrete proposal for ending the war in Ukraine, but Europe's leaders will at least hope they are now back at the negotiating table.
I think President Macron and other European leaders will take some heart from today's meeting. They are at least back at the table and talking. However, there were no reassurances from the president on whether America will provide any kind of security guarantee and whether it would hold out for Ukraine getting its land back. Bear in mind, of course, last Friday, President Trump said President Macron and Prime Minister Keir Starmer had done nothing to end this war. Now he's saying they're being a great help. His view, his mood, his attitudes can change, just like that.
Washington's changing stance on the war on Ukraine has been highlighted at the United Nations, where its envoy has repeatedly voted alongside Russia, as Neda Tawfik reports from New York.
Here at the UN, what was supposed to be a symbolic moment to reaffirm support for Ukraine as it marked the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion, instead turned into a dramatic day of diplomatic tension among allies. The United States not only sided with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea against a Ukrainian resolution in the General Assembly, Washington went a step further to produce its own competing texts there and in the Security Council. Britain and France's ambassadors said that was done without any warning or real negotiations. The Trump administration's text didn't blame Russia for the war or reaffirm Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, Europeans were able to have the U.S. resolution amended in the General Assembly, but not in the Security Council, where resolutions are legally binding. So, for the first time ever, a Ukraine resolution passed in the Security Council, where Russia holds a veto. But it was with that U.S. much more toned down language. The Europeans reacted by saying that there can be no peace that rewards aggression, while the U.S. hailed the passage of a resolution in the Security Council that called for an end to the conflict. Regardless, though, it is an uncomfortable moment for Europeans. For them, this is just reinforcing that there are major fault lines in the transatlantic alliance.
And several world leaders gathered in Kyiv today to offer their continuing support for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. They pledged more financial, military and political help, with President Zelensky saying, "We hope we can finish this war this year." James Waterhouse reports from Kyiv.
In Ukraine, the war is as impossible to escape as the politics surrounding it. For President Zelensky, today was about remembrance and rallying his remaining allies. But there was one big absentee, the US. What followed were talks about military support, the likelihood of Ukraine joining the European Union.
Perhaps they could be earlier than 2030.
As well as the enforcing of any future ceasefire.
And any settlement must be based on a sovereign Ukraine, backed up with strong security guarantees. The UK is ready and willing to support this with troops on the ground.
Welcome everyone to the first G7 meeting of 2025.
Ukraine and its European allies still have to work out how to stand up to Russia in the long term. At a separate gathering, after swerving questions about their relationship, President Zelensky issued this call to Donald Trump directly.
President Trump, we would really like to hear from you, because all our people, all our families are very worried. Will there be support from America? For our people, for life in general, it's so important that American support, American assistance remains.
The diplomatic chat has continued tonight, and there has been some substance today, but the tone has very much been about picking Ukraine up after 2 weeks of American foreign policy that has rocked its war effort. Nevertheless, there still yet might be scope for cooperation between Kyiv and Washington. A deal that would give the US access to Ukraine's natural resources in return for security guarantees is reportedly being finalised. President Zelensky has rejected previous drafts, calling it a debt which would take generations to pay. James Waterhouse, BBC News, Kyiv.
President Trump says he's discussing major economic deals with the Kremlin to end the war in Ukraine. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg has the latest from Moscow.
Vladimir Putin popped up unexpectedly late tonight on Russian state television. They interrupted regular programs for this, and he proceeded to say lots of things that Donald Trump will like. There was lots of flattery. He said President Trump did not act on emotion. He had a rational approach to what was happening. There was lots of praise. He praised Donald Trump's idea for America, Russia and China to slash defense spending. And there were offers of big money projects, cooperation between Russia and America, for example, in the aluminium industry. I think when it comes to dealing with the US president, the Kremlin leader knows exactly which buttons to press. But what about the war in Ukraine and the prospects for peace? Well, from what the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was saying earlier today, it doesn't sound as if Moscow is in any hurry to sign on to a ceasefire. He said this: "We will cease hostilities only when negotiations provide a firm, lasting result that suits the Russian Federation." Until then, Russia fights on, confident, I think, that it can seize more Ukrainian territory.
And for more, I've been speaking to Angela Stent, the Senior Advisor to the Centre for Eurasian, Russian and East European Studies at the Brookings Institute. So I want to start off with Macron's trip to DC. Very much seemed like an attempt to kind of steer Trump back, encourage him not to rush into a deal on Ukraine. And he mentioned the requirement of security guarantees many times. What do you think Macron's key objective was? And do you think he was successful at being this mediator between the US and Europe?
So I think he definitely wanted to steer Donald Trump away from giving away too much to Russia. I think he also wanted to show the Russians that the U.S. and the Europeans can work together, because the Russians have been thrilled to see this break, all these tensions between the U.S. and Europe. So I think those were his objectives. I don't know whether he managed to persuade President Trump to look at the negotiations with Russia any differently. He did put him straight about some of the things that President Trump got wrong about European assistance. But I think we'll just have to wait and see what happens with these U.S.-Russian negotiations to see how successful he was. And then also look to the visit of Prime Minister Starmer in a couple of days here to see what he can achieve.
And meanwhile, we also had European leaders meeting in Kyiv. Do you think that there is agreement in Europe to send those peacekeeping troops? And I thought it was interesting that Trump said that Putin was fine with it, but at the talks that they had in Riyadh, it seemed that the Russians had ruled this out.
Yes, and I mean, the Foreign Minister Lavrov has said on several occasions there can be no European troops in Ukraine, or any country that's a member of NATO can't send troops. So if the Russians have changed their mind, they haven't actually been explicit about this. And so, again, we'll have to see what happens with these negotiations going forward.
And Macron's visit to DC came at a time when the UK imposed fresh sanctions on Russia. A big contrast to what we're hearing, the rhetoric in the US and the talk of possibly lifting sanctions. Do you think that will actually happen, though? And what do you think that's going to do to this big divide between the US and Europe in its approach to Russia?
Well, I think if President Trump believes that he's getting what he wants from the Russians, the U.S. will start to use sanctions. And I'm sure that we don't know what these conversations have been between Americans and Russians that President Trump alluded to today. But maybe they have involved President Putin telling him, you know, you've got to start lifting these sanctions. A stark contrast, not only to what Britain's just done, but also what the EU has recently done, again, with more sanctions. And then there's all this talk about, you know, U.S.-Russian big economic projects, as you reported, Putin talking about this. It's really unclear what there is there. But President Trump, I think he believes that there's a possibility for these economic opportunities in Russia. But until now, none of those have ever transpired really in the past 30 years.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's look at some other stories making the news. Survivors of last summer's knife attack in Southport, in which 3 young girls were murdered, have spoken for the first time. Leanne Lucas told the BBC that she called the police as the attacker, Axel Rudakubana, chased after her. Another survivor, who hasn't been named, said the attacker looked possessed as he stabbed her. The MP, Mike Amesbury, has been sentenced to 10 weeks in prison for punching one of his constituents on a night out. He pleaded guilty to the assault last month. Mr Amesbury has been sitting in the Commons as an independent, having been suspended by the Labour Party. He'll serve 4 weeks of his sentence in custody and the rest on licence. And the Taliban says it will endeavour to release 2 British nationals in their 70s who've been arrested and held in Afghanistan as soon as possible. Peter Reynolds and his wife Barbie were arrested on the 1st of February while returning to their home in the country's Bamiyan province. A US national and an Afghan were also arrested alongside the couple. You're live with BBC News, and the Trump administration has told federal agency leaders to ignore Elon Musk's order that federal employees must send in summaries of their work accomplishments or risk losing their jobs. That's according to the Washington Post, citing sources familiar with the situation. It marks a break with the tech billionaire and head of the specially appointed Department of Government Efficiency, who has had significant influence in Washington since Donald Trump took office. But in the last hour or so, Mr. Musk sent out a message saying that federal employees will be given a second chance to respond to his original email, subject to President Trump's discretion, and that failure to respond a second time will result in termination. And it comes as more than 4,000 employees from the U.S. Agency for International Development are placed on leave as part of cost-cutting measures to curb government spending. I've been speaking to Jeremy Konyndyk, president of the humanitarian agency Refugees International and a former USAID official who served in the Biden and Obama administrations. First of all, Musk's federal worker order, it's dividing even the Trump administration. Some have told workers to disregard Musk's demand, such as the FBI Director Kash Patel, there was the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. It's confusing, isn't it? I mean, how should workers respond to this?
Well, I think what it underscores is Elon Musk is kind of making it up as he goes here. There's no professionalism to this. It's this sort of impromptu ad hoc amateur hour that is really just intended to diminish and belittle the workers of the federal government. They all have they all have terms of reference for their jobs. They all have bosses they report to who know what they do, who are responsible for managing and overseeing them. Elon Musk has no idea what they do. He is in no position to judge what most federal workers do. And I think that's why you see many leaders in the Trump administration, even somebody like Kash Patel, who is a loyalist to President Trump, pushing back and saying, we're not going to comply with this ridiculous order.
And does the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, have the authority, except through regulation, to order another agency's employees to do anything? Unions representing thousands of these federal workers are suing over this email.
OPM normally sets kind of broad standards and guidance for the whole federal government. It certainly does not assess the performance of individual employees at individual agencies. They leave that, rightly, traditionally, to the agencies themselves who know their missions. So I think it is entirely right to question the legality of this. And I think what we've seen from Elon Musk over the last month is he's really not bothering to operate by any kind of law and procedure as he goes about destroying agencies like USAID and trying to push out government workers.
There's been a lot of concern over the confidential and sensitive information to what employees are working on in some of those departments, isn't there?
Yes, there is. The federal government has a lot of what's called PII, personally identifiable information, on its own workers. That is controlled information. It cannot be just disclosed willy-nilly. And of course, then those government personnel have a lot of access to information about everyday Americans and American businesses. And there are no controls and no limitations right now on what Elon Musk is doing. And that means, if he uses that in an abusive way, there's nothing right now stopping him from that apart from these lawsuits.
And as a former USAID official, the administration's putting thousands of these workers on leave. What is going to be the impact of this?
Well, it's going to greatly diminish America's standing in the world. It's going to do immense harm to the millions, tens of millions of people around the world who have always been able to depend on support and solidarity and partnership by the U.S. government. If there were an earthquake in the world tomorrow, normally the U.S. would deploy search and rescue teams, and often the very first foreign search and rescue teams to show up would be the American teams. Those teams can no longer get off the ground because they basically pushed out all of the staff who were responsible for deploying them.
And what is the collateral damage of these DOGE cuts overall? Where else do you think he's going to target?
Well, in a USAID context, which is what I'm most familiar with, it is damaging HIV programs. 35 of 39 countries that have reported the status of their U.S.-funded programs have said there have been major disruptions. I've talked to many humanitarian peers who've said that they are having to pull back their life-saving field programs, shut down nutrition stabilization centers, things that really do save lives day in, day out, are being disrupted right now. And I think if they are that cavalier about costing lives abroad, it's really frightening what they might contemplate as they begin focusing on agencies closer to home here in the U.S.
The United Nations Secretary General has voiced alarm at rising violence in the occupied West Bank after Israel's announcement that it is expanding military operations there. Israel expelled residents of 3 refugee camps in the occupied West Bank on Sunday. Defense Minister Israel Katz said 3 camps are now empty after residents were evacuated, a move that the UN considers to be the forced displacement of 40,000 people. It comes as mediators have been trying to solve the latest hurdle in Gaza ceasefire negotiations. On Sunday, Israel ordered an indefinite delay on the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners, accusing the Palestinian armed group of repeated ceasefire violations. Hamas says the move puts the ceasefire in grave danger. Our Middle East regional editor Sebastian Usher has more.
Mediators are trying to resolve the latest obstacle that is causing problems and potentially could put the ceasefire in Gaza off track. That is the decision by Israel to suspend the release of 600 Palestinian prisoners who were due to be freed from Israeli jails on Saturday in exchange for 6 Israeli hostages that Hamas returned to Israel on Saturday. Now, we're coming to the end of phase 1 of the ceasefire deal. That is meant to see this week, in the coming days, Hamas hand over 4 more bodies of hostages who died in captivity in Gaza. But Hamas may well refuse to do that until it has a guarantee that these Palestinian prisoners who haven't been released will be released. The special US envoy, Steve Witkoff, says that he is coming to the region in the coming days and that he's going to try to resolve this issue, perhaps through blurring the division between a phase 1 and a phase 2, simply having an extension of phase 1, which would lead, as far as Israel is concerned, as far as the US administration is concerned, to what they're after, which is not anymore a kind of phased release of hostages in Gaza, but to have them all released in one go. But that depends on Hamas accepting the conditions and Hamas also having a guarantee that those Palestinian prisoners will be freed and that those who are expected to be freed in the next round of hostage releases will also be freed. And of course, Hamas also wants to ensure that there's a full troop withdrawal by Israel, that there's a permanent end to the hostilities. These are all issues that were meant to be negotiated and discussed and then to be dealt with in phase 2. At the moment, things are up in the air. People in Israel, people in Gaza are wondering what is going to happen next.
Let's turn to some other important news around the world. The Vatican says there's been a slight improvement in the Pope's condition as he continues to be treated for pneumonia, but he is still in critical condition. The 88-year-old is spending an 11th night in the hospital. People held a prayer vigil in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City. The European Union is suspending some of its long-running sanctions on Syria in a bid to help reconstruction months after the ousting of Bashar al-Assad's regime. The easing will help Syria's energy, transport and banking sectors, but strict sanctions will remain on weapons, narcotics and equipment used for repression. Tech giant Apple says they plan to invest more than $500 billion in the US over the next 4 years and create 20,000 jobs. That will start with a new advanced manufacturing factory in Texas set to open next year. The vast majority of new jobs will be in research and development, software and artificial intelligence. And the likely new Chancellor of Germany has issued a stark warning. The US no longer cares about Europe and the continent must take charge of its own defence. Speaking after his Christian Democrats won the election, Friedrich Merz questioned whether the NATO military alliance can survive in its current form. He also condemned comments from US President Donald Trump and Elon Musk before the German election, calling them outrageous. Mr. Merz now faces weeks of coalition talks amid a surge from the far-right AfD, which came in second place. And the soul singer Roberta Flack, one of the defining voices of the 70s and 80s, has died at the age of 88. Mark Savage looks back on her life.
The first time ever I saw your face,
intimate, emotional.
I thought the sun
Roberta Flack redefined the sound of soul music in the 1970s. This was her first hit, but she didn't get there until her 30s. She grew up in a segregated suburb of Washington and won a university music scholarship. But as a black woman in the 1950s, she had little chance of success. For a decade, she was a teacher by day and worked the clubs by night. It was the tender quality of her voice that eventually led to a recording contract and hits like this.
Strumming my bed with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his.
She inspired the next generation of young black singers, from Lauryn Hill to Alicia Keys. In 2020, she was given a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Grammys. By that stage, she was in a wheelchair, and 2 years later, she announced she had motor neurone disease that left her unable to sing. But that extraordinary voice will remain her legacy.
Roberta Flack has died at the age of 88. That is all we have time for, but do stay with us here on BBC News. Goodbye.